Okay, so this is a fireside chat panel discussion with Liran and Ashish. I'm gonna intro them in just a second. Actually, in fact, all three of us previously worked at Snyk. In fact, Ashish has a super broad background in security, having actually a ton of CISO roles, as well as being an amazing presenter and host of a couple of podcasts. Most well known for the Cloud Security Podcast, and also started up a new AI CyberSecurity Podcast. Liran Tal has a super strong engineering background, although it's in JavaScript, and he's a lead in the DevRel team at Snyk. I worked with Liran for many, many years, probably too many years, maybe some might say, but it's an absolute pleasure having you both on. So welcome.
Pleasure to be here, man.
Thank you for having me, a JavaScript person.
Yeah, of course. I'm going to ask the first question, and probably this is going to be quite pointed at you, Liran. Do LLMs write secure code?
No. Well, the real answer is sometimes, not all the time, not very often, depends. So basically, no.
No. Okay. Is when we think about writing secure code and security with AI, I guess we probably think closer to the first party code. Is that the main risk, the only risk? What are we thinking are kind of like the core things that developers have to worry about?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it, because you could kind of like think of this as my first party code, like my code, is basically your third party code, because maybe I'm like a maintainer of a library and I built something and I used AI to do that. So it's my first party code, but then it becomes a component that you actually use down the stream. So it's actually like all over the place. It's just code that could meet you in very various places. And from that aspect, it's basically, it's just like first party code, but it's really everything else.
Yeah. And I guess this kind of like leans into when we think about infrastructure these days, Ashish, it's just code, right? So is this from the cloud point of view? I guess we're talking about it in exactly the same voice, right? There's no differences, or are there?
I guess I'm someone who keeps an optimistic view. Considering I've been talking about AI cybersecurity for some time now, what I've realized, and I guess I'm partially in agreement with Liran, so I'll probably add some context to this as well. I think I talk about the example, and we talk about this quite often in the AI CyberSecurity Podcast, where it's like, when the self-driving car came in first, everyone like, I'm gonna die. This is gonna be the most horrible experience. But someone quoted an example, which I had not read of until that point, was like the number of accidents that happen by humans far outweigh the number of accidents potentially could be prevented if everything was self-driven. Now, I'm not saying we are there yet with code at the moment, but at the same time, my viewpoint is whether it's your cloud code or your JavaScript code or your Java code, irrespective, I think we're definitely closer than we were before to improve the quality of the code we're producing. And I think that's kind of where, as I said, I've got a very optimistic view, not because as a security person, I kind of have to find a silver lining in the fact that, the new technology is going to keep evolving and we're going to create a space for ourselves. And all of us are here talking about AI native space as well, what that could mean for the future of development as well. Are we going to be like, I guess I love, I do want to do a shout out to the podcast that you ran. I think the most recent episode you guys did between yourself, Guy, and the conversation around where this AI native thing is going to go in terms of whether we're going to think about developing code using the construct that we live in today and how we develop code, or are we going to focus on, and I can't remember the exact word, but it's almost the way it was explained made me think of Iron Man, where how Iron Man just goes, Jarvis, can you just go and do this kind of a thing? It's like you have an idea, you want to implement, you want to architect instead of trying to figure out whether SQL injection is the biggest problem you care about right now. I think that's where I'm leaning more on, but hopefully kind of that gave some context. But keen to hear what you guys think as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, I got two things to follow up on that. I guess one, first of all, when we think about what the code that AI produces versus the code that we produce, are we putting the bar of what is acceptable code higher for AI than we would ourselves. And that's the kind of feeling I got when you were talking about self-driving cars, for example. It's okay for a human to have a crash because that's human to do that. But when an AI car crashes, or an AI-driven car crashes, it's bad because we can blame the computer on that. We can blame individuals who wrote that code, whatever it is. Are we setting that bar higher? And I guess, Liran, maybe you should answer that as a JavaScript developer.
I like what you did there, Simon.
Did you like that? Nothing's changed in 6 years, has it, Liran?
No, nothing. It's just the same. So first off, yes, I think we are setting the bar higher. Like if we set it lower, that would be kind of like pretty bad for us, right? Like we kind of like want to have it. We want to have code drive everything, right? So we want to have code, not humans, drive, heart pacers, things like that. You want to have, code ride the railways and not humans and stuff like that. So because you want to scale that out, because you kind of like want to automate the whole thing, because you want to throw code at everything, right? So there's, infrastructure as code, security as code, everything as code. And suddenly, the world becomes, itself kind of like defined by code because everything gets kind of like hyper productive replacement by AI. So yes, of course, you want the bar to be set high. You want a very low kind of error rate. And I think that's the goal. And we haven't been there yet. And really the whole breakthrough transformers and everything else that kind of been happening in the last, I don't know, like 4, 5, 6 years or so in aggregate is kind of like showing us that this is where we want to go. And I think we want to be productive. We want to be able to run code fast, but at the same time, it has to be secure. It has to be performant. It has to comply with specific regulations and policies that we would want to see and branch outside. That's kind of like the goal. That's what takes us from point A to D without going through B and C. And I think that's where we should be aiming for.
I was gonna say, is it the nervousness that makes us keep a higher standard for AI code? Like, are we nervous about the fact that there is more vulnerabilities being added? Are we nervous about the fact that, hey, is it going to do better than me? Like when the first Uber evolution kind of happened, when before that we were all taught growing up, never get into a stranger's car. Now we're like, oh, just go all the way. Like as long as the number matches, don't really worry about verification, anything. Just get into any car you see.
But like self-driving like cars had like millions of like data points of like kilometers driving or whatever like throughout, right? That's what got them to be like super good at what they did.
100%.
Of human trained, like it's from human drivers, so it's actually picking up all those same errors. Actually, that follows into my second question from what Ashish was kind of like saying. He mentioned kind of like, I think you mentioned code injection or something like that. When we think about the risks, are the risks, is it like an exaggeration of existing risks? So it's just, there's going to be more code. We're able to deliver faster and so forth. As a result, is it just that we're going to get an increase? We're effectively in a more autonomous way adding these types of issues, or are there other risks that beyond the typical security vulnerabilities that we should expect in our code?
Oh, sorry, who was that for? Liran or
anyone? I think. Go on.
I can go. I have some opinions on this as well, because I think I probably lean on the whole. We actually have seen this happen. Funny enough, whether it's your application code, infrastructure code, when we went down the automation path, everyone who was doing automation, they wanted to do the low risk activity being automated first. No one wanted to go automation production. That was never the case. So I imagine similar evolution would happen with code that is created, whether it doesn't matter what kind of code it is, as it's created by AI agents, as people are, or agentic AI, as Gartner is calling it now. Whatever the terminology use, or the kind of AI you might use, what you would find is at every point we would, as humans, make a call for, hey, am I okay for the quote unquote AI agent to just take over this thing? And I'm happy with the fact that, hey, you know what? It's a backend function, happens in the middle of the night. Even if the service goes down, doesn't really matter. Or we'll flip it around to say, actually, you know what? It's in the hospital. I don't want it to go and create anything which is potentially life-threatening. I guess as humans, as much as one would want to put money as the most important thing, at the end of the day, life is probably kept at a higher level. So I imagine when it comes to things like your security compliance, or when it comes to, I guess, the quality and the automation and the usage of AI would be driven by more how where it's used for automation. Similarly, like low activity tasks would be automatic. It would happen more frequently and probably would happen even quicker. Like I think there's a lot of use cases for security operation people already out there. We're already using for documentation, summarization, and a lot of other things. But where it would make a difference, and I think where it would still remain slower and probably the adoption would reduce quite a bit, and not because of nervousness, it's just because of the criticality of what that change could do in terms of a health hospital, health data. It's not going to expose, but hopefully breaches reduce, but it was not going to expose my health data on the internet, hopefully.
Mhm.
But at least if it does, some human would want to check that before the change comes.
You are very optimistic, Ashish.
I did start by saying I'm a very optimistic person, because I do
optimistic.
want to, by the way, for people who are watching this, listening later, I wanted to say that security people are considered as negative people. I'm trying to change that perspective. That's kind of like my aim. But it's like, as much as security people think the Skynet is real, I want to change the perspective that I know there is some productivity here. AI is going to help improve our productivity as well, not just for the business.
It does help.
With your CISO hat on, then, Ashish. So you talk, even with those services which maybe aren't as super critical, what would you do differently compared to an existing workflow whereby you have automated tests and things like that, knowing there is AI generated code, or even with automated pushes and things like that? What would you do differently in your workflow to defend against potential whether it's errors, whether it's vulnerabilities and so forth that are being injected at various points?
I'll probably answer this from the current point in time perspective, because I still feel we haven't reached that pinnacle for code. So I'll probably answer based on what it is today, in terms of whether it's the use of LLMs or use of AI agents, or whether it's use of productivity app. I think that primarily, I would say, the three areas that you would find, and for anyone who's listening as well or watching this, the first one being me as a developer using a quote unquote authorized Copilot or a third-party Copilot. That's the number one risk people talk about. I'm okay because I have a Microsoft E5 license. I want people to use Copilot. But these days, if you just Google for Copilot, there's so many Copilots out there. Now, you don't know which one you're using. So putting a filter for Copilot is probably not the best approach to filter out third-party. So anyone who may be using, say, a Copilot agent or a coding agent from a Hugging Face website or another website that is open source, that probably is the number one risk a lot of people talk about, where yes, we want to improve the code being created and code being generated out, but are we trusting the right source to be creating that code? So that's the first risk that most people talk about. The second one people talk about is, sorry?
No, I said yes. I was like nodding.
Cool, that you agree as well.
Yes.
The second one I was going to talk about was more around, I think it's been called the LLM firewall, but the idea behind this is that it's the data coming in and out. So the data that you are giving to your LLM, whether it's your internal or external LLM, or the data that you're getting back from it, are you trusting it in one go? The ideal approach over there people talk about is the fact that you keep your LLM model as dumb as possible, so that you just manage the data security of what's going in and what's coming out, rather than thinking about, what my LLM security looks like. Now, the challenge with that is, and most organizations, this is the way they're approaching it, they have a wrapper or a proxy around ChatGPT or Claude, which is probably the two most popular LLM models. Very few people are creating this at this point in time, because it just takes a lot of money to create your own LLM model. The ones who are using they're probably using the Claude or the OpenAI version. So the LLM firewall kind of comes in where, hey, we have an agreement with ChatGPT. We're using the enterprise version or the Claude enterprise version. That's what we're going to use from API call perspective. So that's kind of where that second space is. The third one, which is probably the most boring one, but still relevant, is the third-party risk that we all talk about as people who work in cybersecurity. We have agreements with all the third parties we work with, whether it's your Microsoft, Amazon, doesn't really matter who you're working with, Salesforce, anyone else, or any other third party you think of. I definitely find that the third bucket that's been growing for a while is where we are talking about third-party risk between, say, if something happens to the ChatGPT data, although it's impossible for you to kind of train your data by just dumping your data into it, because it requires a lot more information than just me me uploading my my current pay slip into it. Suddenly, it has my sensitive information. But that's the kind of the third risk. But it hope may make sense. I mean, I'm curious if Liran or yourself have more risks that you can probably talk about that maybe me and other CISOs who are listening can actually learn from as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking from from the if I put on the coder hat again, I think from that perspective, and this is a Yoda coder hat. So what it means is basically, I think it translates to a large kind of like blind spot that exists for developers. That's kind of like where I sit. So what it means is in practice is let's go back to like 10 years ago or so, maybe more, when the cloud started, and you'd put like something on an S3 bucket, like a file that got uploaded. So while you thought that was like maybe secure, you did not save that file on disk, you did not have like path traversal vulnerabilities and things like that. And then the backend or the front end team, whoever uses the asset, would kind of like, I think, treat the asset as secure, right? Because it doesn't come from user input. It's on my S3 bucket, right? The file name is mine. Yeah. But actually, if that file name existed and like had, like a script tag in it, like an XSS injection payload thing, then that would get saved as a string on the bucket. It wouldn't do anything to like the AWS console. But the moment you trusted that and you took that and just injected that to the DOM and just like added that as like, like a non-DOM purify, now escaping and nothing else done there, output encoding, I love those things, because you trusted that this is your data and not something else, that's the game over, right? And I think it kind of like exists with LLMs in the same way. Kind of like you use the LLM, but like, prompt injection, we kind of like look at it from the perspective of having, what I put it, like changing the behavior of the LLM to do something else. In most of the time, people think about it like, like the Lakera game, right? Like give me the password or do something else, order a new car, reserve a new hotel at $1 for me, all of those things. But at the same time, if you use that LLM as a source for something, like you use that output in your database in something else, it might as well, you could prompt inject it to actually produce code that if you like do not practice SQL query correctly with like prepared statements, then you'd get an SQL injection. That's like one example. So I think what happens is it creates more blind spots that we did not know about before or did not like pay too much attention to before. Other example could be maybe like the training data. So imagine like being able to like poison things like pickle files and PyTorch files where you serialize some data. Maybe that data that was serialized got into some third party. They were able to like maliciously inject some payload into the data. It gets unserialized again, and then the model suddenly does something else that it shouldn't have done before. But like as a developer, you don't even think about this aspect of like my training set, my training data, my model, my tensors, all of those kind of things. And that's like a whole blind spot that exists as a vulnerability, as an attack vector. And suddenly because of LLMs, you kind of you use that workflow, but it wasn't apparent before that this was like a security issue. Yeah. Because all the data was something that you trusted, right? It was like, if you like to take a look at like, 15 years ago, AI work, machine learning data, it's stuff that you ingested, based on your internal, data scientist team and stuff like that. And there would be some guarantee that, there's no SQL injections in there. There wouldn't be some undesired behaviors in there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this, when we think about training data, and there are absolutely attacks and threat vectors when we talk about data poisoning and things like that. But of course, training data is not perfect anyway. And when we think about the difference between source code and infrastructure as code is a good example. We had Armin Dadger on the podcast, and there were some really interesting thoughts which kind of like made me really ponder the differences between training data from an IAC point of view to a first party code, source code point of view, and what people will typically put on open source repos. There are going to be different levels of what people try to put on. For example, if I was to have an LLM train on a ton of my open source Java code, JavaScript code, whatever it is, there's going to be good examples there of how I might want to do something, whether it's in an enterprise way or a non-enterprise way. However, when we think about infrastructure as code, I think there's a different level of acceptance as to whether an enterprise level IAC file is going to be uploaded into an open source repo or not.
Yeah.
For example, if there are, and this was one of the examples that Armand gave, if there are way more public buckets in the world, and of course from the enterprise side you would expect, okay, there will be a few but not many. When there are way more public buckets in the world, if I ask for an S3 bucket, the LLM is most likely going to give me a public bucket, right? But that's not, from my point of view, what I actually want as my default, because it's insecure by default there. So does this mean that, first of all, every AI generated IAC, if I ask for an S3 bucket, is going to come back to me as public? And I guess the bigger question is the training data for IAC just not relevant as much to an enterprise need? And is there anything we can kind of do about that? Ashish, this is way in your
quality of the data that you use. I think, but it's a good point though, because I would question. So most of the enterprise that I've been talking to who are trying to build LLMs or chatbots or whatever the use case for themselves is, I think a lot of them are using their existing internal data to build their LLM models. Now, to your point, I mean, the whole context or the premise of where we started was that we as humans are already producing bad quality code. So like they're probably training on bad quality code and bad quality infrastructure as code as well. There's a multitude of challenges that we're already facing in our day-to-day jobs as developers, as architects, or security people as well. So perhaps to your point, I would flip that analogy to more how reliable is your internal data that you're using to train your model. Yeah, I mean, 100%. I would love for it to do the right thing, but does anyone have the time to go through their internal data, whether it's structured or unstructured, do they trust the quality of it? I mean, but then if we do not, and we go outside and, to your point, look at the data that's being somehow produced by an LLM agent that helps me build amazing quality code, but what I did not realize is behind the scene, it was using all the public S3 buckets, and that's what it gave me. I think it would be a balancing act at that point in time, but I truly believe where we sit at this point in time, and I think the way most of these LLM agents are going, a lot of them have gone down the path of having an enterprise license and having a private. So even in Microsoft Azure, you can have a completely private LLM, does not talk to the internet. You're still looking inside. So I imagine there's a bit of time required before it gets to a point where people are comfortable. But their training data is always going to be the problem. Like, I think as much as all of us are excited and want to jump onto the bandwagon, yes, I want to do AI, but then you realize Ashish, who was there 6 years ago, left basically a bag of rotten potatoes just lying around and never even bothered naming it. There was no tags on it. There is no, like, this is part of the area that no one touches, no one talks about, and now suddenly LLM wants a piece of it. That would make many people nervous. So I feel like there's a journey to be had over here, and I would say we're still in the starting phase. So I think hope that makes sense, because I kind of feel like there are two parts to it, but also we are still in the beginning stages.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and I think the next step, I guess, there when we think about not just finding issues or refining what the LLMs put out is actually making suggestions to fix. And in that point, I guess, the LLM is just as capable of suggesting fixes first time around versus identifying issues and then creating fixes around them. What are the risks in relying upon those fixes or suggested fixes to my code? And I guess we're talking about security here today, but we just had a performance session last time around. It's going to apply to a ton of different areas, but specifically, and Liran, I think you're probably well placed here from the first party code point of view. Yes, AI can suggest fixes. What are the risks?
So I would say it's against suggest fixes, but the fixes will be suggested based on some, statistical model out of whatever it got trained on and whatever context it thinks it has, but it doesn't really has the right context. And I think that is key. So like, there's so much that is going on within, like, when you go beyond like the benchmark, sample repository that you compare, various tools around and code and like to do apps that you build with AI. Once you go deep down enough and things get complicated, I think at that point, there's a ton of context that is needed. and understanding of code flow. So I will give you one example that I think makes total sense, where LLMs would actually try to fix something, but would actually get you hacked. So imagine that you are on a piece of code in your file, and you are working with URLs, and you practice something that's maybe like URL encoding, or like you like ask the result of the AI is giving you some code that relates to that, and you ask it to like secure it, right? And it says, okay, let's do URL encoding, or the other way around, let's do URL decoding, whatever, like it depends on like the current process. let's say that this is what it suggests. And by the way, that's probably one of the things it should do. So like that's a proper process. But what happens when it is not aware that somewhere up the chain, right? Let's say this is your service, and in some other service you interact with, or the route, the controller, whatever the architecture is, you actually already did a URL encoding. So now you have double URL encoding, and that is potentially like a security vulnerability like waiting to happen due to the double encoding. And so if the LLM doesn't know to like trace your code paths and say, well, you actually did an encoding before, you should not really reapply the encoding because you could suffer the double encoding injection, then that's gonna get you busted. And so that's why it needs more than being just a statistical model. And sometimes like vulnerabilities in most of the cases honestly are very nuanced and very complicated. While it's sometimes easy to just demonstrate some code injection, some cross-site scripting that we show in a vulnerability, and there it is. It's usually, most of the time, vulnerabilities are chained together. They are more complicated. People chain one to another, like a prototype pollution to do code injection, to do command injection, to open a shell. There's like a layered approach when things happen in the real world, rather than what we kind of demo. So having that nuance and understanding is I don't think that kind of like fits the statistical model. And maybe those things, maybe those LLMs and AI agents and the whole Gen AI general way of coding get smarter, where it will be able to then kind of like infuse several learnings and several paradigms together, like both the model but also some applied logic and something else. That would be great, but like at this point in time, it's just super basic, and it's as if it kind of like saved you the time to like Google how to properly do path validation versus just asking the LLM. It's not at that point where you would ask it to fix it and you could count on it.
Yeah. Very interesting. We've got a minute or so till Q&A. Let's invite the audience to also ask some questions while the audience is thinking of questions and pinging them into the chat. I'd be interested in just asking more of a cultural question. And I think when we think about DevOps changes over the last 10, 20 years or so, we've seen platform teams, we've seen this amazing DevOps engineer role been created. I personally see there's a place on that platform team for maybe certain security engineers and people who do work closely with the developers, the paved road style approach. When we so first of all, maybe it'd be interesting to hear your thought on that. But beyond that, do we see it from an organizational change point of view, an AI security paved road or anything like that also sitting in the platform team? I'd love to know how you think the teams are going to change. Ashish, why don't you lead us with this?
I think so there is already, I guess, many companies have already started working on AI projects, and the way they're dealing with this at this point in time is the platform engineers themselves are the ones who are, because from a workload perspective, if you look at the components that get used for building an AI application, those really haven't changed. I guess you still use Kubernetes as your foundation layer. You still have databases. So all that layer hasn't really changed. So those people would still continue to work on it. I think the only point you would see evolution like that when the number of AI applications outweigh the number of regular applications you have. So it kind of happened to your point example where we started with DevOps, we had cloud, became cloud security engineers, cloud security this, cloud security that. Then Kubernetes became popular. Then let's just do Kubernetes security engineer. I think it just comes down to if we ever get to a point where the number of applications which are AI driven in your organization are more than the regular non-AI driven, or by then they are quote unquote legacy application, then yeah, maybe we'll see that, but maybe not right now, I guess, kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Liran?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a bit early to call like an AI security engineer. I think it's definitely not early to have like AI engineering teams, just because that's like very like that's like AI is here, right? Like LLMs are here. They're like, among us. Sometimes they present themselves as Java LLMs, which you shouldn't trust. But they are among us, and I think AI engineering is something that should probably exist. I think AI security engineering is a bit deep down. It's indeed like, I don't know if there's like Kubernetes security engineers. It's like very, very, very specific. You kind of like, I think, like depend on the tooling, the ecosystem, the foundation, to like run a bunch of like, the security responsibility. To an extent, you can like outsource the risk because it's a third party and things like that. And I somewhat feel like, Ashish, that it's kind of early to understand what it is, since we don't exactly know like even how to secure it properly. So we'll see.
Yeah. Question coming in from the audience. Min asks, it's interesting that open source code used to be seen as more secure than proprietary code because open source projects are transparent about potential vulnerabilities. I gather from what you are saying now, is that no longer the case when it comes to models and agents? Did I understand this correctly?
I think it's still the case, though. I think it's still the case that both open source and proprietary data cannot be trusted. That's where I guess the whole foundation of the nervousness that we all have is that no matter which way you face, if you look at internally, there was the Ashish example that I went for, who left a bag of rotten tomatoes ages ago. That is still hanging around. There are parts of the organization that we still don't touch or talk about. That is interest. So that is never going away. It's still going to be there. If you look at open source, I think I'll go back to the episode example that you gave, Simon, earlier, where Armon kind of spoke about the levels of, like, I did my first GitHub repository back when I was trying to understand what is it to code something, and that repository is still there, to the point that today, when I'm teaching people Kubernetes and cloud and all of that, I have the mature repository as well. I mean, the same Ashish has two repositories which are completely different experiences. I've never touched the first one again because I'm just too embarrassed to talk about it now that I did it publicly. But still, I think that's where I find that I would say there's untrust or nervousness on both sides. I wouldn't say one is better than the other.
Yeah.
Or more
Yeah.
secure.
I would I think it's more nuanced, and it's really hard to compare open source code, like comparing third party dependencies with like third party models. If that's what you kind of want to compare, it's super hard because I think the foundation is very different. So for example, to review and scan, like get an audit of an open source third party package, I could see the maintainers, I could see who contributed, I could see a Git log of all the code added, how it was added, when fixes were made, right? Like in the code, in the releases, I can see what third party it uses to do things. I can have like, provenance and attestation at like the signature level of how versions were published. I don't really have that level of data at the model, right? Like I cannot see like how exactly was it trained. I am maybe being told how, but I don't know how it was actually. I don't think like the same standards of how you do code to how you train models exist yet. And I think that's like the nuance that kind of escapes, and it's kind of like easy to maybe overlook. But I think that's an important aspect when you need to audit, code versus a model.
Yeah. We're pretty much out of time, but I want to add this last question because I feel like it's a really great question from Macy here. What about social engineering risks? When teams leveraging generative AI, what steps can be taken? What steps can teams take against this? Or is it too early? Do we not know what those are just yet?
I would say there's definitely some, and I guess there are different ways to take the social engineering aspect. The one that comes to mind with Gen AI is the fact that I work as a developer and I want to know what's the salary of Ashish the CISO. Because I'm just curious. He seems to be quite fancy on the internet. I wonder where he gets all the money from. So, the way people are talking about this at the moment is that there needs to be almost like a quote unquote data access manager, for lack of a better word. The way people are doing this is, how do you manage access for different identities based on their roles? That is one aspect for social engineering. I would argue this could be done better in the AI world, because you have a lot more sense, you have a lot more understanding of where your data is, what kind of data it is, and who can access it and what they should be doing. It's not just a policy document, it's actually implemented. I think that's where I feel that'll be really interesting, but in some aspects really early, because we haven't really seen AI based attacks at scale. So we don't really know what social engineering could be like as well. So maybe in that aspect, maybe too early.
Cool. I'm being shoved off stage here because we have another session starting in just a few minutes. So first of all, a massive thank you to both Ashish and Liran. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the AI Native Dev.
Likewise. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.